The targets are locked at these
Navy
coordinates.
SEAL
We
asked
are
her
ready
rank
to
as a
initiate
joke,
the sequence
then
on your
froze
command,
when
sir.
she rolled up her
Execute the order,
sleeve.
Major.
The command center was silent,
You will stand
unnaturally
down and follow
silent.
the chain of command,
Rows
Captain.
of massive screens
Cannot
wrapped
accept
around
that
the
order,
room
sir.
like a
The
glowing
mission is
fortress of blue
compromised
light,
if we wait.
each one pulsing
We
with
move at
encrypted
0300.
data,
The target is
satellite
heavily
feeds,
guarded, but we have the
intercepted
advantage of surprise.
communications,
Failure
and
is not
shifting
an option.
tactical
Understood,
overlays.
Commander. We're
The
ready.
air hummed
Change
with the
of
low
plans.
vibration of
We're
machinery,
advancing to the
yet no
ridge
one dared to
immediately.
speak. It was the
Acknowledged.
kind of silence
Moving.
that carried weight, the kind born from tension,
We're running out of daylight.
not calm.
Keep moving.
In the center of
maintain
that
formation,
glowing
and watch
storm
the ridges.
stood a
We
young
have to
female
secure that
service
objective
member.
by 1800 hours.
Her hair was tied in a tight bun, loose strands framing a face that looked far too composed for someone in a room filled with officers senior to her. She wore a plain gray t-shirt, simple, unarmed, unembellished. Yet her posture radiated a controlled intensity that didn't match her modest appearance. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. Something about her presence felt wrong for a junior enlisted soldier. Not wrong as in suspicious wrong as in she didn't belong at the bottom. Her eyes were steady, sharp, absorbing every flicker across the screens as if she understood the entire battlefield in a single glance. She didn't fidget, didn't shift her weight, didn't show the slightest sign of hesitation. If anything, she looked like the only one in the room who wasn't overwhelmed by the cascading data. Behind her, a small formation of Navy SEALs stood at ease. Normally, SEALs radiated a casual confidence, smirks, folded arms, joking comments under their breath. But not now. All of them were watching the woman in front of them with a seriousness that didn't match her outward rank. One SEAL unconsciously straightened his posture. Another clasped his hands behind his back. A third subtly shifted his stance to give her more space. They weren't behaving like men standing behind a subordinate. They were behaving like men standing behind someone they respected. From the left side of the room, a senior officer in a crisp dark blue uniform strode forward. His cap was perfectly aligned, his ribbons polished, his boots spotless. He walked with the casual authority of a man accustomed to respect, and the amused lift at the corner of his mouth showed he had already made an assumption about the woman standing in the center. When he stopped in front of her, he tilted his head slightly, as if sizing her up. "All right," he said with a light joking tone. "What rank are you exactly?" A few heads turned. A few others froze. He thought it was a harmless joke, just a bit of teasing at the expense of a young technician who happened to be standing in the wrong spot at the wrong time. But the SEALs behind her exchanged glances. Their expressions tightened. One of them had seen this moment coming. The second the officer opened his mouth, another pressed his lips together, trying not to react. A third shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if silently warning, "You shouldn't have asked that." The woman did not smile. She did not laugh. She did not even blink. Instead, she slowly turned her body toward the officer. She lifted her arm with deliberate calm, no rush, no theatrics, and rolled up her sleeve. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Conversation died. Even the hum of the monitors felt quieter. A symbol inked deep, dark, sharp spread across her upper arm. Not a decorative tattoo, not something youthful or rebellious. A mark that carried weight. A mark tied to an operation that most soldiers only whispered about. A mark that wasn't worn by recruits, technicians, or anyone below the highest tier of covert special operations. The officer's smirk collapsed instantly. His jaw tightened. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. He knew exactly what that symbol meant. And Hestefan, heels clicking together as his spine snapped straight. Then, in front of everyone, he raised his hand in a crisp, unmistakably formal salute. The SEALs behind her didn't move. They didn't need to. They had already known. Across the room, a dozen pairs of eyes stared in confusion, disbelief, or dawning realization. Officers who outranked her on paper suddenly weren't sure of anything anymore. The woman remained perfectly still, returning nothing but a cool, unreadable expression. No one else in the room had any idea who she really was, but they were about to find out. For several long seconds after the officer's salute, no one in the command center moved, as if the entire room feared disrupting the sudden shift in authority. The woman kept her arm raised just long enough for everyone to clearly see the inked symbol on her skin, and the weight of that revelation spread across the room like a silent shockwave that struck each observer differently. Some felt confusion, others felt awe, and a few felt a cold realization as they recognized a mark normally hidden behind layers of classified clearance. When the officer finally lowered his salute, his movements felt stiff and uneasy, because he realized the gesture had become mandatory the moment he understood what he had seen. The SEALs behind her held their positions with perfect discipline, yet subtle changes in their posture revealed a quiet satisfaction that the truth had finally surfaced in front of the entire team. Their eyes stayed locked on her with a mixture of respect and steady confidence, as if they had long anticipated this moment and expected someone else to acknowledge her true standing. Across the room, analysts exchanged uncertain glances, trying to understand how a woman who appeared to be a junior technician now commanded a level of recognition rarely shown to anyone outside high-tier operational circles. Even the endless data flowing across the screens seemed less important than the tension settling over the command center like a heavy fog no one could escape. The woman lowered her arm with measured composure, letting the sleeve fall naturally, though the image of the tattoo remained etched in everyone's memory. She lifted her gaze and met the officer's eyes with a calm intensity that cut through the awkward silence like a clean blade through paper. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a steady authority that contradicted her outward appearance and made several people unconsciously straighten their posture. She explained that the shifting patterns on the screens required immediate focus, and that questions about her background would not be addressed until operational security allowed such discussion. The officer swallowed hard, realizing the depth of his mistake, and stepped back with a rigid nod that revealed more embarrassment than respect. Without speaking, the SEALs moved a few inches forward into a more protective formation behind her, reinforcing a chain of authority that no one had noticed earlier. Their synchronized shift created an invisible barrier around her, yet she did not show any sign of relying on them for reassurance. Instead, she radiated a quiet confidence drawn from experience rather than rank. As she approached the central interface, the officers nearby hesitated before instinctively stepping aside, unsure whether they were following protocol or simply reacting to the force of her presence. She began typing on the main console with smooth, practiced motions, and the chaotic clusters of enemy data compressed into a clear and organized display that revealed patterns previously overlooked. Her movements carried the precision of someone trained to interpret high-level tactical signatures under extreme pressure, not someone who merely studied them in controlled simulations. Within moments, every screen shifted into a unified map that exposed the enemy's true formation and revealed their concealed approach toward the perimeter. She traced a line across the digital terrain, explaining in concise, deliberate sentences how the adversary had masked their advance using layered electronic interference. Several officers stared at the display in disbelief, realizing they had analyzed the same intelligence for hours without identifying what she pinpointed in under a minute. The senior officer attempted to regain control by asking how she recognized the pattern so quickly, but even he could not hide the uncertainty behind his voice. She did not turn to address him. Instead, she kept her focus on the interface while answering with a controlled, low tone that carried the weight of first-hand experience. She explained that she had encountered this exact maneuver during a classified joint task mission overseas, and that the operation had nearly collapsed because leadership underestimated the enemy's tactical discipline. Her words silenced the room immediately, because they were not spoken to impress anyone, they were spoken to warn them. The temperature in the command center felt colder as her meaning settled into everyone's thoughts, and even the SEALs remained unusually still as they processed the implications. Analysts rushed to update their projections based on her insights, and several officers recalculated their response plans with newfound urgency. For the first time, the entire room began to understand that her presence was not accidental or symbolic. She was there because the operation required someone with her exact background and lethal familiarity with these threats. She continued outlining the precise steps needed to counter the enemy's formation, and her voice carried the kind of calm clarity that only came from leading missions where hesitation could kill an entire team. By the time she finished speaking, no one viewed her as a technician, a support specialist, or an analyst. Standing in the center of the room with the SEALs behind her, and the operational map glowing across her face, she radiated the unmistakable energy of someone who had seen more than the rest of them combined. In that moment, the entire command center understood a simple, unspoken truth. She had been the most experienced operator in the room from the moment she walked in. The command center remained unnervingly quiet as the tactical display pulsed across the towering screens, casting shifting blue reflections over every focused face in the room. Although she had already demonstrated more operational clarity than the entire staff combined, she continued analyzing the data with the calm discipline of someone who understood the threat was still evolving. The SEALs behind her watched the monitor with steady intensity, maintaining formation while waiting for her next move with the quiet certainty of soldiers who trusted her judgment implicitly. When she zoomed into the eastern quadrant of the battlefield, the atmosphere shifted as a new formation appeared that none of the analysts had identified earlier. What previously looked like scattered enemy movement now restructured into a coordinated infiltration pattern frequently used by disciplined strike teams trained to exploit communication gaps. A ripple of unease moved through the analysts as they exchanged anxious looks, realizing they had missed the signs due to heavy terrain masking and intermittent jamming. She leaned closer to the console, her tone low and controlled as she explained how the formation aligned with a known adversary unit adept at slipping through blind spots before launching precision assaults. Her voice carried the steady weight of first-hand experience, and several officers instinctively straightened as they recognized she wasn't guessing, she was recalling something she had survived before. The SEALs behind her shifted almost imperceptibly, signaling their recognition of the unit she described and confirming that her assessment carried real authority. She adjusted several filters on the console, revealing faint thermal signatures moving in synchronized paths toward a narrow access point in the perimeter fencing. The moment the indicators appeared, several officers inhaled sharply, realizing how dangerously close the enemy had come to breaching their defenses without detection. None of them had seen the pattern earlier, because the enemy had used layered interference to bury their movements beneath environmental noise. The senior officer approached with cautious steps, his voice quieter now as he asked what options remained for intercepting the threat. She did not turn toward him. Instead, she remained focused on the shifting data while explaining a three-phase countermeasure involving rapid redeployment, high ground advantage, and synchronized suppression fire. Her explanation was crisp and precise, and every part of her tone reflected the voice of someone who had executed similar maneuvers under far worse conditions. One of the younger analysts hesitated before asking how she knew the enemy would attempt that exact breach point, and she paused just long enough for the room to recognize the personal weight behind her silence. When she finally answered, her words were measured and subdued, explaining that she had encountered this same unit during a joint task extraction mission in the Eastern Range, where their infiltration pattern nearly triggered a catastrophic ambush. The officers absorbed her statement with growing realization, and the room shifted from doubt to complete trust in her assessment. She expanded the map again, marking the likely timing of the enemy's next movements, while identifying choke points where a specialized team could pressure the formation and disrupt their advance. Her motions were fluid and practiced, revealing not only her ability to interpret data but her instinct for anticipating hostile behavior. The officers watched her with a level of respect that bordered on awe, gradually understanding that her insight wasn't theoretical, it was operational and earned through experience they didn't share. As the logs updated in real time, the senior officer asked which unit she believed was capable of executing the countermeasure effectively, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. She finally turned, meeting his eyes with a steady look as she stated that a SEAL detachment familiar with her previous mission would be required for a successful interception. Behind her, the SEALs exchanged subtle nods, acknowledging a responsibility they understood deeply and accepting it without hesitation. The analysts began recalculating projections based on her strategy, and the screens lit up with updated trajectories, confirming the viability of her plan. The command center shifted from confusion to coordinated urgency, as officers and technicians moved to align communication channels and prepare rapid deployment protocols. Even the air seemed sharper now, as if the room itself understood that her presence had reoriented the entire operation. She remained at the console, refining timing windows for the enemy's potential breach, while adjusting markers to account for interference shifts in the terrain. Her expression remained calm yet intensely focused, revealing that her mind was already transitioning from analysis to execution. The SEALs behind her stood ready, their posture steady and their attention fully aligned with her lead, knowing she had guided teams through worse situations than the one unfolding on the screen. By the time she finalized the operational sequence, no one in the command center viewed her as an outsider, a consultant, or an unusually skilled technician. They recognized her as the operative who not only understood the enemy but had survived them, studied them, and learned how to dismantle them with precision. Her presence no longer raised questions, it provided direction. As the final deployment notification sounded across the room, a single truth settled with undeniable clarity. She wasn't just the most experienced operator there, she was the one who would determine whether they made it through the next hour alive. The command center shifted from tense observation into coordinated motion as officers relayed rapid orders across multiple channels, each directive reflecting the woman's strategy with surprising speed and precision. She remained at the primary console, scanning every incoming update with disciplined composure, her focus sharpening as she watched the battlefield evolve in real time. Behind her, the SEALs stood ready, their quiet posture revealing a calm but unmistakable readiness for the operation she was guiding toward execution. She pulled the map wider, isolating the enemy's lead element as faint signatures advanced through terrain channels that dictated the rhythm of the approaching fight. The room watched closely while she plotted likely breach attempts, her movements steady and practiced, shaped by experiences far more demanding than any training module. Officers exchanged uneasy glances as her annotations exposed blind spots their automated systems had overlooked, realizing they relied too heavily on algorithms that couldn't read battlefield intent the way she could. When she identified the secondary infiltration corridor concealed beneath a dense canopy and layered rock, the tension deepened because the route would allow a devastating flanking maneuver if left unsecured. She pointed toward a narrow crest overlooking the area and explained that a small overwatch element could intercept enemy movement early enough to destabilize the entire formation. Her tone carried a firm certainty that made the SEALs exchange quick, knowing looks, silently acknowledging the role being shaped for them. The senior officer stepped forward carefully, asking whether the Overwatch team required specialized optics, though his voice suggested he already deferred to her judgment. She tapped into an alternate feed, revealing distortions caused by earlier jamming pulses, and explained that multi-spectrum gear was essential to cut through the interference. Her answer was crisp and direct, prompting technicians to adjust equipment lists with the urgency of people who now trusted her assessment without question. Analysts updated troop projections as she refined the data stream, and the tactical display gradually evolved into a synchronized operational picture that matched her understanding of the enemy's approach. Officers moved between stations with a focus rarely seen because her clarity removed hesitation and replaced it with purpose. Each adjustment she made revealed another layer of insight that none of them possessed, confirming she understood the enemy's rhythm with an almost surgical precision. She zoomed into a third potential breach point, hidden beneath a shallow rise that earlier scans had dismissed as irrelevant. Her fingers glided across the interface as she merged topographic overlays with thermal residue, exposing reconnaissance scouts searching for structural weaknesses. She stated that these scouts typically marked anchor points for a larger assault push, and recommended placing a counter-recon team along the opposite ridge to deny their observation. Before the officers could relay the order, the SEALs had already shifted their stance, silently acknowledging the assignment. She stepped back to assess the entire operational picture, allowing the map to update while she recalculated timing windows tied to the enemy's concealed advance. Her expression hardened slightly, not with fear, but with the focus of someone who had learned how quickly a well-organized strike group could dismantle an unprepared defense. The SEALs sensed the shift and straightened, recognizing that she was no longer analyzing the battlefield from a distance. She was preparing to enter it. The senior officer hesitated before asking whether she intended to join the forward element, though the question felt unnecessary the moment it left his mouth. She turned toward him with calm conviction, explaining that the strike group they faced was known for rapid mid-operation adaptation, and that real-time recalibration would be essential for a successful counter. Several officers stiffened as the implication settled. Without her on the ground, the entire plan risked collapsing under evolving enemy pressure. The SEALs accepted her decision instantly, their slight nods revealing both trust and recognition of her operational history. She moved beside them, reviewing loadouts with quick, efficient eyes, making minor adjustments to ensure their gear aligned with her projected contact windows. Her familiarity with their equipment reflected experience that went beyond analyst credentials. She adjusted placements with the precision of someone who had carried identical kits under hostile conditions. She returned to the console briefly, refining the timeline of enemy acceleration based on updated thermal shifts, and her voice remained steady as she outlined final instructions. Officers transmitted her directives across secure lines, preparing staging zones, redirecting drone coverage, and aligning support teams to match her sequence. Every movement in the command center became sharper and more synchronized, influenced by the quiet authority she carried without needing an official title. When she finished analyzing the last data cycle, she stepped away from the console for the final time, her posture shifting into the confident readiness of a field operative rather than a strategist. The SEALs formed around her without hesitation, accepting her presence naturally, as if she had always been part of their formation. Her eyes lingered on the tactical display one last time, internalizing the enemy's pace and rhythm with the practiced instinct of someone who had learned to survive at the edge of uncertainty. The deployment alert sounded through the room, echoing against steel walls as officers moved into coordinated alignment with the plan she had constructed. She tightened the strap of her gear, her expression unwavering, revealing a level of resolve that steadied everyone watching. In that moment, the command center understood they were no longer sending a team into the field. They were sending the one person who had already shaped the outcome before the mission even began. As she stepped into formation with the SEALs, the truth settled over the room with unmistakable clarity. She wasn't only joining the fight, she was the reason they stood a chance of winning it. The loading bay roared with controlled activity as the SEAL detachment advanced toward the transport vehicles, each operator moving with focused precision that reflected the gravity of the mission underway. Fluorescent lights flickered across steel flooring while technicians secured final gear checks, their movements quick but careful, ensuring every piece of equipment aligned with the tactical demands the woman had outlined. She walked among the operators with calm determination, reviewing each loadout with practiced eyes that understood how even a single misplaced item could shape the outcome of the operation. The SEALs adjusted their vests and calibrated their optics as she inspected their gear, her motions efficient and deliberate, shaped by experiences far more severe than anything occurring inside the bay. Although no one spoke unnecessarily, an unspoken rhythm connected the entire group, created by the trust they placed in her expertise and the respect she earned without ever requesting acknowledgement. She paused at the rear of the transport vehicle, checking the multi-spectrum optics one last time before giving a slight nod that signaled her approval of the team's readiness. Outside the bay, the wind carried faint traces of dust and distant engine noise, mixing with the growing tension that accompanied every high-risk deployment. The perimeter lights cast long shadows across the staging area, framing the SEAL detachment as they prepared to move into the darkness, with a mission few others could execute successfully. She climbed into the lead transport, settling beside the operator responsible for navigating the rugged terrain ahead, her posture steady as she reviewed the tactical display projected on the portable console. The vehicle doors slammed shut with a muted thud, and the engines rumbled to life, gradually building into a powerful vibration that echoed through the bay before the convoy rolled forward. As the transport moved across uneven ground, she monitored the shifting signals on her handheld screen, watching faint enemy signatures flicker along the ridgelines where the strike group positioned their lead scouts. The SEALs remained silent while reviewing hand signals, breach sequences, and fallback routes, coordinating with a precision developed through countless hours of joint training. The terrain outside grew darker and more uneven as the convoy advanced beyond the last perimeter checkpoint, entering a zone where visibility dropped sharply due to terrain masking and residual jamming. She lowered the console's brightness, studying the movement patterns that indicated the enemy's scouts were drawing closer to their observation positions. Her voice remained calm as she relayed minor adjustments to the team leader, ensuring their insertion path would place them just outside the enemy's anticipated detection range. The SEALs listened attentively, absorbing each instruction with the focus of operators, who understood how quickly an infiltration could unravel if even one variable shifted unexpectedly. She highlighted a narrow stretch of elevated ground where the enemy's approach would likely funnel into a predictable pattern, allowing the Overwatch element to establish visual contact before the main force advanced. Her tone carried a certainty that reassured the team, despite the obvious complexity of the terrain they were entering. As the convoy neared the designated drop point, The lead vehicle slowed, the tires grinding against loose gravel as shadows deepened around the surrounding hills. She stepped out first, adjusting her vest and securing her headset while the cool air pressed against her face, sharpening her senses for what awaited them in the darkness. The SEALs followed her lead, forming a tight perimeter as they scanned the terrain for any signs of enemy movement, their shadows merging with the uneven ground beneath the scattered moonlight. She raised her hand in a precise gesture, directing the overwatch element toward the ridge, overlooking the secondary infiltration route she had identified earlier. They moved with practiced stealth, disappearing into the jagged terrain without making a sound, their silhouettes blending seamlessly into the slope as they navigated the narrow ascent. She watched their progress briefly before turning her attention to the remaining operators, guiding them toward the concealed path that would position them for rapid engagement once enemy contact was confirmed. The team advanced across the rough terrain with deliberate caution, each step calculated to avoid loose rocks and sudden noise that could alert the scouting units positioned ahead. She moved at the front of the formation, her eyes scanning both the tactical display and the environment around her, identifying subtle temperature shifts that suggested the enemy was closer than the data indicated. The SEALs mirrored her pace, maintaining tight formation while communicating through brief hand signals that kept the entire unit synchronized, despite the darkness pressing around them. As they reached a narrow saddle between two ridges, she paused and knelt behind a cluster of rocks that provided natural cover, gesturing for the team to hold position while she analyzed the updated readings. The faint signals on her display strengthened into clear thermal silhouettes that indicated the enemy scouts had established their observation posts along the opposite ridge. She adjusted the magnification, tracing the scouts' slow movements as they surveyed the perimeter, confirming that the enemy's timeline aligned precisely with her earlier projections. The SEAL team leader crouched beside her, studying the display with a focused expression that acknowledged her accuracy and the urgency of their next steps. She outlined the timing sequence in a calm whisper, emphasizing the narrow window they had to neutralize the scouts before the strike group advanced, and the leader nodded with the steady confidence of someone who trusted her judgment fully. The operators prepared their weapons with quiet efficiency, aligning their optics and adjusting their positioning while awaiting her signal to proceed. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the familiar tension of imminent engagement, her mind aligning the mission's final variables with the enemy's approaching movements. The SEALs watched her carefully, recognizing the shift in her posture as the silent indicator that the operation was entering its decisive phase. The night air grew heavier around them, as distant rustling confirmed the presence of enemy units advancing along the path she had predicted, their silhouettes emerging faintly against the ridge under the filtered glow of multispectrum optics. With one steady gesture, she signaled the team to move into position, initiating the opening step of a mission that would test every moment of preparation they had undertaken. The SEALs responded without hesitation, dispersing across the terrain with the seamless coordination of a unit that trusted its leader completely. And as she rose to follow them into the darkness, one truth became unmistakably clear. She wasn't merely leading the team toward the threat, she was guiding them into the exact moment she had prepared for her entire career. The ridgeline stretched before them like a jagged scar across the terrain, its uneven shadows concealing the precise vantage points where the enemy's scouts had positioned themselves earlier in the night. As she advanced with the SEAL detachment, the narrow path forced them into a tightly controlled formation that demanded absolute silence and perfect footwork to avoid triggering loose gravel that could compromise their approach. The air grew colder as they climbed, carrying faint traces of dust and distant movement that hinted at the presence of hostile observers scanning the valley below. She paused behind a cluster of boulders and raised her fist in a quiet signal, prompting the SEALs to drop into low stances that blended their silhouettes with the ground. The thermal display on her handheld screen pulsed softly as she adjusted the sensitivity, revealing 2 concentrated heat signatures near the crest where she had predicted the scouts would establish their lookout positions. Her calm breath fogged slightly in the night air as she analyzed the spacing between the enemy units, calculating the exact sequence required to neutralize them before they transmitted a warning. The SEAL team leader crawled to her side, studying the display with focused attention while awaiting her assessment of the distance, wind drift, and movement patterns. She pointed toward a small outcropping located several yards below the crest, explaining in a low whisper that the scouts had chosen the highest available cover but lacked lateral escape routes due to the terrain's natural funneling. Her voice remained steady as she outlined the optimal approach vector, emphasizing the need for silent elimination to prevent the strike group from accelerating ahead of schedule. The team leader signaled 2 operators forward, their movements smooth and controlled as they advanced along the shadowed edge of the ridge without disturbing the loose stones beneath their boots. She monitored their progress through her optics, adjusting magnification levels to maintain visual contact despite the shifting angles created by the slope. Every motion aligned perfectly with her earlier predictions, reinforcing the precision of her analysis and the importance of addressing the scouts before the enemy's main force committed to its assault. As the operators neared the designated positions, she detected a faint shift in one of the enemy heat signatures, indicating that the scout was repositioning to scan a different portion of the valley. She warned the team leader with a soft click in the headset, prompting the operators to freeze instantly and wait as the scout swept a narrow beam of infrared light across the terrain. The beam passed dangerously close to their location, illuminating the rocks only a few feet from their position, before continuing toward the opposite ridge and finally settling back into its original pattern. She exhaled quietly, recognizing how narrow the margin had been, and signaled the operators to continue advancing before the scout changed his observation cycle again. The SEALs moved with renewed caution, using the natural contours of the ridge to conceal their silhouettes as they approached strike distance. She observed the scene closely, her eyes shifting between the terrain and the thermal map, calculating the precise moment when the elimination must occur to maintain the element of surprise. When the operators reached their positions, the team leader glanced at her for final confirmation, trusting her judgment before initiating contact. She scanned the environment once more, checking the wind, distance, and timing of the scouts' movements before giving a single, deliberate nod. The operators reacted immediately, executing synchronized takedowns that unfolded with silent efficiency, neutralizing both scouts before either could send a distress call toward the strike group below. The elimination occurred so swiftly that the surrounding terrain barely registered the disturbance, and only the faint shift in thermal signatures confirmed the scouts were no longer active. She watched the feed carefully, verifying the absence of additional enemy units before signaling the team to regroup near the ridge crest for further assessment. The SEALs moved back with controlled precision, their steady breathing and calm expressions revealing a quiet confidence in their ability to carry out the next phase successfully. As the team reassembled behind the rocks, she reviewed the updated tactical overlays, noting how the enemy strike group had not yet altered its movement pattern in response to the scouts' removal. This confirmed her earlier assumption that the unit operated under strict communication discipline, relying on periodic check-ins rather than constant real-time updates. She used the brief window to reposition the team, pointing toward a narrow descent that would place them closer to the predicted convergence point where the enemy's advance would become fully visible. The SEALs descended cautiously along the sloped path, their controlled footsteps blending with the subtle hum of distant wind patterns echoing across the valley. She led the formation with practiced confidence, adjusting her pace to maintain concealment while also ensuring they reached the next observation point before the enemy's timeline collapsed. Her handheld device flickered with intermittent thermal spikes as the strike group's leading units approached the designated corridor, confirming that the operation was aligning precisely with her projections. As the team reached a shallow depression offering natural cover, she halted and knelt beside a fractured section of stone that provided clear visibility over the enemy's approach route. She recalibrated her optics and scanned the terrain ahead, watching the faint silhouettes of the strike group advance with steady discipline along the path concealed beneath overlapping branches and jagged rock formations. The SEALs settled into firing positions behind her, their silhouettes blending seamlessly with the terrain as they awaited her next decision. The tension thickened as more enemy signatures appeared, their thermal outlines revealing a larger force than the earlier projections had suggested, confirming that the strike group had mobilized additional units under the protection of the terrain's natural masking. She relayed the updated count to the team leader, her voice calm despite the implications of the reinforced enemy presence. The operators listened closely, adjusting their gear and tightening their formation in preparation for the engagement that now hovered only moments away. She scanned the far ridge one last time, verifying that no additional scouts were present before shifting her attention to the advancing force below. Everything aligned with the scenario she had anticipated hours earlier in the command center, and the SEALs waited in silence as they recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. The night seemed to hold its breath along with them, the terrain growing still as the enemy unknowingly marched toward the trap she had designed. When the lead element stepped into the open corridor, she gave a quiet, decisive signal, initiating the moment the entire mission had been building toward. And as the SEALs prepared to strike, one truth became clear. The first phase had unfolded exactly as she predicted. Now the fight was about to begin. The moment the enemy's lead element stepped into the open corridor, the stillness of the night fractured as she raised her hand in a precise, deliberate motion that triggered the SEAL detachment into immediate action. A controlled burst of suppressed fire sliced through the darkness, striking the first wave of hostile units before they could react, their formation collapsing quietly beneath the sudden precision of the ambush. The valley absorbed the sound with eerie softness, amplifying the tension as the enemy forces scrambled to regain order under the pressure of a coordinated assault they had never expected. She adjusted her multi-spectrum optics and shifted several feet to a secondary position, providing a wider angle that allowed her to monitor the developing engagement with tactical clarity. The SEALs executed the plan flawlessly, dispersing along both sides of the ridge to maintain overlapping fields of fire while keeping their silhouettes hidden against the fragmented terrain. The enemy attempted to retreat into cover, but their movements revealed predictable patterns she had outlined earlier, enabling the team to anticipate each counteraction with the calm precision of seasoned operators. A cluster of hostile units attempted to flank the SEALs along a narrow ledge, but she signaled the overwatch element with two sharp gestures, prompting them to reposition and intercept the maneuver with controlled bursts that halted the advance instantly. The wind carried faint traces of dust and metallic scent as the valley shifted under the momentum of the engagement, each echo of suppressed fire blending with the rhythmic cadence of coordinated movement. She knelt behind a jagged section of stone, watching the strike group reorganize under pressure, their formation tightening into a defensive arc meant to counter the ambush. The team leader slid beside her to receive updated positioning cues, his breathing steady despite the unpredictable variables unfolding across the terrain. She traced two quick lines across her handheld display, highlighting the enemy's remaining maneuver vectors and identifying a gap in their defensive pattern caused by their rushed realignment. Her instructions were calm and concise, enabling the SEALs to adapt seamlessly while maintaining control of the engagement's tempo, despite the growing number of hostile signatures appearing along the ridge. As enemy reinforcements surged from the rear, the terrain erupted with splintered rock and scattering debris as rounds impacted near the SEALs' cover positions. She shifted left to gain a better vantage point, her eyes narrowing behind the optics as she calculated the precise angle required to cut off the incoming wave. The team responded instantly when she relayed the updated coordinates, repositioning into a staggered formation that created a choke point along the corridor, effectively slowing the enemy's advance before it could gain momentum. The battle intensified as more enemy units pressed forward, their movements increasingly erratic as they attempted to locate the source of the team's coordinated strikes. She could hear their frustrated commands through faint, intercepted transmissions, each one confirming the growing confusion spreading through their ranks. The SEALs held their ground with disciplined control, adjusting their fire with deliberate accuracy while maintaining low profiles against the uneven terrain that shielded them from sustained counterfire. She crouched behind a rock ledge and scanned the valley floor, recognizing a shift in the enemy's formation that indicated they were preparing a concentrated push toward the center of the corridor. Her voice remained steady as she relayed a flanking directive to the two operators positioned near the lower ridge, instructing them to intercept the movement before it reached critical range. The operators responded immediately, relocating with silent agility and applying suppressive fire that forced the enemy to break formation before their coordinated surge could begin. Despite the SEALs' advantage, the enemy continued to press forward with relentless determination, attempting to overwhelm the team with sheer numbers rather than tactical finesse. She observed their shifting patterns carefully, detecting micro-adjustments in their movement that suggested they were searching for an exposed approach vector along the ridge's narrow slope. Recognizing the risk, she signaled the team leader again, urging a temporary repositioning toward higher ground to maintain visual superiority and prevent the enemy from gaining a foothold. The SEALs adjusted their positions with impressive discipline, using the fragmented terrain to mask their movement while preserving their overlapping lines of fire. She followed the team leader to a slightly elevated vantage point, her boots finding stable purchase despite the loose gravel and uneven rock formations beneath her feet. From this new angle, she identified a concealed cluster of enemy operators preparing to deploy a compact signaling device meant to alert the rest of their force deeper within the valley. She raised 2 fingers in a sharp motion, prompting the closest operator to adjust his aim and neutralize the device before it could emit a transmission. The enemy unit reacted with immediate aggression, unleashing a volley of suppressive fire that forced the SEALs to shift into temporary cover while recalibrating their next movements. She ducked behind a slab of fractured stone, her breath steady despite the sudden barrage, analyzing the rhythm of the enemy's attack to identify openings within their aggressive push. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the muted echoes of distant movement that indicated additional enemy groups were closing in from the western ridge. She updated the team leader quickly, emphasizing the need for tighter formation to prevent the SEALs from being divided by the oncoming force. The team consolidated their position with controlled precision, moving as a cohesive unit that relied on practiced coordination rather than verbal communication to maintain operational stability. As the hostile reinforcements neared the valley's edge, she identified a narrow window to regain momentum by exploiting a temporary gap that formed between 2 advancing enemy elements. She relayed the coordinates with calm urgency, prompting the SEALs to reposition for a concentrated strike that halted the enemy advance before it could merge into a unified force. The coordinated attack disrupted the enemy's rhythm entirely, creating a momentary pause that allowed the team to reassert control over the engagement. The enemy's initial surge faltered under the pressure of the SEALs' precise countermeasures, and she recognized the subtle shift in momentum as a critical turning point that would define the next phase of the confrontation. She scanned the terrain one final time, confirming the diminishing signatures of the forward units before signaling the team to prepare for the strike group's next phase. The night air vibrated with tension as the echoes of battle lingered across the valley, a silent reminder that the engagement was far from over. And as she rose from behind the rocky ledge, her eyes fixed on the advancing shadows with unwavering focus, one truth settled across the battlefield. The enemy had walked into her trap, and now the real fight was about to begin. The brief silence that followed the SEALs' counterstrike dissolved quickly as the enemy recovered from the ambush, reorganizing their formation with an unsettling efficiency that revealed the disciplined structure of a highly trained strike group. She studied the shifting thermal signatures across her display, watching the hostile units expand laterally across the valley floor in a coordinated pattern designed to stretch the SEALs' defensive lines thin. The movement confirmed what she already suspected, that the adversary was far more experienced than most units operating in this region, and that their next actions would be calculated rather than desperate. The SEAL team leader crawled beside her, his breath controlled as he waited for her assessment of the enemy's unusual maneuver, recognizing that the rapid shift in formation indicated a more complex strategy unfolding beneath the surface. She zoomed into a section of the map, highlighting the hostile operators moving along the western ridge with deliberate precision as they attempted to secure elevated ground before launching a counteroffensive. Her tone remained calm yet firm as she explained that the enemy intended to compress the team's movement corridor, creating a choke point that would undermine the SEALs' tactical advantage. A sudden burst of hostile fire erupted from the ridge, scattering debris across the rocks as the enemy attempted to suppress the SEALs' ability to reposition. She ducked behind a narrow column of stone, her pulse steady as she analyzed the pattern of fire, recognizing the disciplined rhythm of marksmen trained to control terrain rather than simply overwhelm it. The SEALs responded with measured counterfire, maintaining low profiles while gradually shifting toward a more defensible position that preserved their ability to maneuver through the fragmented landscape. She signaled 2 operators to relocate toward a cluster of boulders that overlooked the enemy's advancing western flank, emphasizing the need to establish visual dominance before the strike group gained full access to the high ground. Their controlled movements blended with the dark stone and shifting shadows, allowing them to reach the elevated perch without drawing unwanted attention from the hostile units sweeping the area. She monitored their progress through her optics, adjusting magnification to track the enemy scouts, coordinating the counteroffensive with unsettling precision. As the operators secured the vantage point, they identified additional hostile silhouettes emerging from a concealed ravine that had not appeared on earlier scans due to heavy interference. She recalibrated her display and confirmed the new signatures, realizing the enemy had deliberately masked their presence until the SEALs committed to the initial engagement. The revelation tightened the tactical parameters of the mission, forcing her to reconsider the enemy's potential reinforcements and the likelihood of a deeper strategic objective driving their actions. The valley erupted with another wave of coordinated hostile fire, sending a cascade of shattered stone fragments across the SEAL's cover positions as the enemy attempted to pin them down. She shifted to a new angle and scanned the terrain, identifying the source of the increased pressure as a support unit positioned along the far ridge, providing suppressive fire to facilitate the strike group's advance. The SEAL team leader relayed instructions to the operators, adjusting their positions to maintain overlapping fields of fire while preventing the enemy from narrowing their escape routes. She pointed toward a fractured section of the eastern slope, explaining that the terrain's natural curves would allow a flanking maneuver to disrupt the enemy's suppressive fire team without exposing the operators to concentrated return fire. 2 SEALs advanced immediately, navigating the steep incline with silent discipline as they moved behind the hostile vantage point. She tracked them through her optics, her fingers steady on the display, as she monitored the enemy's shifting patterns for any sign of detection. The valley trembled with quiet tension as the 2 operators reached their position and launched a surprise counterattack, neutralizing the suppressive fire team and creating a temporary opening in the enemy's formation. She signaled the rest of the team to reposition, guiding them toward higher ground that would enable them to regain control of the engagement despite the increasing number of hostile units emerging from the far ravine. The enemy reacted quickly, altering their formation once more as they adapted to the shifting terrain and reorganized their movement pattern with alarming speed. As she watched the enemy's rapid readjustment, her expression tightened, recognizing a deeper structure in their coordination that suggested a more experienced commander was directing their movements from an unseen position. She examined the thermal data closely, detecting faint heat signatures along the far ridge that indicated the presence of a secondary unit observing the battle and feeding information to the strike group. The realization forced her to reassess the scale of the operation, understanding now that the hostile forces were not merely reacting, they were preparing for a larger maneuver designed to encircle the SEALs entirely. The SEAL team leader crouched beside her again, his eyes sharp as he absorbed her updated analysis and understood the growing threat they faced. She outlined a new positioning plan that required the team to shift toward a concealed ravine along the northern ridge, where natural cover and elevated terrain provided an opportunity to break the enemy's encirclement. Her voice remained steady as she explained the timing, emphasizing that the maneuver had to occur before the enemy's second unit completed their relocation and sealed the escape routes. The SEALs prepared to move, tightening their formation as they loaded fresh magazines and adjusted their gear for rapid repositioning through the uneven terrain. She scanned the valley once more, confirming the enemy's shift toward a multi-angle convergence that threatened to overwhelm the team if they hesitated for even a moment. The night air seemed to vibrate with tension as the strike group advanced with renewed momentum, their silhouettes merging into a unified formation that reflected a level of discipline rare among hostile units encountered in the region. She signaled the team to begin the maneuver, her stance steady as she led the initial descent into the ravine, trusting her earlier analysis to guide them safely through the narrow path. The SEALs followed with flawless coordination, moving as a single entity that relied on minimal communication and maximum discipline to navigate the treacherous slope. Behind them, the enemy continued to close in, unaware that the team had already shifted toward a more advantageous position designed to counter the next phase of their strategy. As she reached the base of the ravine, she scanned the ridge above, confirming the distant silhouettes of the secondary unit, preparing to redirect the strike group toward the narrowing corridor. Her eyes sharpened as she recognized the enemy's intention to compress the battlefield into a tight funnel, forcing the SEALs into direct confrontation on their terms. She inhaled slowly, recalibrating her display and analyzing the terrain once more before signaling the team to prepare for the next engagement. Because the enemy had adapted quickly, but now they were walking into terrain she understood better than anyone on the field, and the next move would be hers. The ravine walls loomed sharply on both sides as the SEAL detachment moved deeper into the narrow corridor, their boots pressing silently into the uneven ground, while the enemy's formation tightened behind them. She advanced at the front, her eyes shifting between the dim terrain and the fluctuating signals on her handheld display, analyzing each movement of the hostile units as they converged on the position with unnerving precision. The enemy's rapid adaptation confirmed that they were no longer probing for weaknesses. They were committing fully to a coordinated push meant to trap the team within the enclosed terrain. The SEAL team leader moved beside her with cautious steps, his breath steady as he scanned the ridge above for silhouettes that might indicate the enemy's next assault vector. She pointed toward a jagged cluster of rock formations that disrupted the natural slope, explaining in a controlled whisper that the terrain would amplify the enemy's advantage if they allowed themselves to remain funneled for too long. Her tone carried a weight that made the leader nod immediately, understanding that their survival depended on creating space before the enemy completed their multi-angle convergence. The valley behind them erupted with scattered bursts of hostile fire, sending loose stone fragments cascading down the slope as the strike group advanced with relentless momentum. She ducked behind a fractured ledge and reviewed the updated thermal readings, her eyes narrowing as she traced the subtle pattern emerging across the enemy's movement. It was a formation she recognized instantly, a staggered assault rhythm designed to compress a retreating force until they lost the ability to maneuver, leaving them exposed to a coordinated kill zone. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the familiar tension that came before a tactical pivot, then signaled the team leader with two quick gestures that indicated a change in direction. The SEALs immediately tightened their formation, shifting toward the ravine's northern wall, where the slope widened into a narrow shelf capable of supporting a rapid lateral maneuver. She led the ascent with practiced confidence, using the jagged rocks for support as she climbed toward a vantage point that would allow the team to intercept the enemy's converging units from above. As she reached the elevated shelf, she scanned the terrain below, analyzing the enemy's synchronized advance and the spacing between their forward and support elements. The thermal signatures revealed a distinct separation, indicating a temporary vulnerability within the enemy's approach that could be exploited if timed precisely. She relayed the coordinates to the team leader, explaining that the window for a counterstrike would be brief and dependent on disrupting the formation before the rear elements repositioned into support range. The enemy continued closing the distance, their silhouettes emerging more clearly against the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the broken clouds. She adjusted her optics and tracked the lead units navigating the ravine floor, noting the precision of their movements and the disciplined spacing that allowed them to maintain pressure without exposing themselves unnecessarily. The sight confirmed that the strike group was led by operators with experience in confined terrain, increasing the urgency of her next decision. She pointed toward a fractured span of rock that extended over the ravine, suggesting a flanking approach that would allow the SEALs to attack from an elevated angle while remaining concealed by the natural curvature of the slope. The team leader acknowledged the plan with a terse nod, directing two operators to move along the upper path while the remaining members positioned themselves behind cover along the shelf. She monitored the enemy's progress as the operators advanced, carefully ensuring their movements remained undetected amid the shadows cast by the jagged rock formations. The valley grew tense with anticipation as the strike group shifted into final convergence, their formation tightening into the same pattern she had identified earlier, a compression meant to force the SEALs into a kill zone where escape became impossible. She recognized the tactic instantly, having encountered it during the classified operation that had shaped much of her understanding of the enemy's capabilities. The memory sharpened her focus, fueling her determination to preempt the maneuver before it trapped the team in the deadly corridor. The enemy began their push with sudden aggression, unleashing a coordinated volley that struck the rock face with explosive force, scattering debris across the shelf as the SEALs pressed themselves tightly behind cover. She calculated the rhythm of the enemy's fire and recognized the brief pauses between volleys, a pattern revealing the exact moment when the strike group shifted positions to execute their compression strategy. She signaled the flanking operators with a single sharp gesture, prompting them to initiate the counterstrike before the enemy completed the maneuver. The operators struck with silent efficiency, targeting the enemy's midline elements and disrupting the synchronization that held their formation together. She watched the thermal signatures stagger under the unexpected attack, their once tight convergence faltering as confusion spread across the strike group. The remaining SEALs capitalized on the disruption immediately, repositioning along the shelf and applying controlled fire that forced the enemy to scatter rather than advance. The valley echoed with the chaotic rhythm of shifting engagement as the strike group attempted to reform under pressure, their movements revealing the strain of losing their previously impenetrable cohesion. She tracked the enemy commander's silhouette among the rear elements, noting how the individual signaled aggressively to realign the scattered units, despite the increasing vulnerability. Her expression hardened as she realized the commander understood the risk, but refused to abandon the maneuver, a sign of stubborn discipline or deeper operational pressure. She directed the team leader to target the enemy's relay operators positioned along the western ridge, explaining that eliminating their communication backbone would prevent the strike group from regaining synchronization. The SEALs executed the order with swift precision, neutralizing the relay units and severing the flow of instructions guiding the enemy's assault. The strike group's movements shifted from coordinated aggression to fragmented attempts at recovery, revealing the first signs of uncertainty within their ranks. Sensing the enemy's hesitation, she stepped forward to a protruding section of the shelf, scanning the terrain for the final piece of the pattern she expected to emerge. When she spotted the secondary unit attempting to reposition for a supporting push, she signaled the SEALs to adjust their angle of fire, cutting off the reinforcement before it could integrate with the remaining hostile forces. The coordinated strike shattered the momentum of the enemy's final attempt to regain control, leaving them exposed across the valley floor with no clear path forward. The battle's rhythm slowed as the enemy's confidence faltered, their once disciplined formation reduced to scattered clusters struggling to reorganize under crushing pressure. She observed the battlefield carefully, her breathing steady as she recognized the exact moment the tide shifted irreversibly in the SEALs' favor. The valley, once dominated by the enemy's aggressive maneuvering, now echoed with the fading resistance of a force that had lost its advantage. And as she lowered her optics, her eyes reflecting the shifting shadows of the broken formation below, one truth settled over the ravine. She had dismantled their strategy piece by piece, and now the final phase was hers to control. The scattered enemy units tried desperately to regain their cohesion, but the valley's broken terrain and the relentless pressure from the SEAL team left them struggling to reform into anything resembling an organized force. She monitored their movements from the elevated shelf, her eyes narrowing behind her optics as she watched the hostile silhouettes shift erratically across the uneven ground. The strike group's once disciplined formation had fractured into smaller clusters that lacked both direction and reliable communication, forcing them to improvise under circumstances they had never intended to fight in. She crouched beside a jagged outcrop and analyzed the emerging thermal pattern, recognizing the subtle signs of a final attempt by the enemy commander to rally the remaining units into one last defensive arc. The SEAL team leader slid into position next to her, his breathing steady, despite the prolonged engagement, as he awaited her assessment of the hostile alignment taking shape below them. She pointed toward a cluster of silhouettes gathering behind a fractured ridge, explaining that the enemy commander was likely consolidating the most experienced operators for a decisive counter-assault meant to regain momentum before their formation collapsed entirely. A sharp burst of hostile fire struck the rocks above them, sending fragments scattering across the shelf as the enemy attempted to suppress the SEAL's elevated vantage point. She pressed herself against the stone and recalibrated her optics, scanning the valley to identify the marksmen coordinating the barrage from concealed positions along the eastern ridge. The SEALs responded with controlled counterfire, maintaining low profiles while gradually shifting to cover positions that preserved their angle over the rapidly tightening battlefield. She studied the scattered signatures again and recognized the familiar rhythm of a fallback defense, one she had encountered during the classified operation that had nearly cost her team years ago. The enemy commander was attempting to establish a fortified semicircle that would protect their retreat while creating a deadly funnel for anyone attempting to advance. She clenched her jaw as the memory resurfaced, the pattern echoing a tactic that had once turned a narrow fight into a devastating ambush, and she understood that the team needed to break the formation before it solidified. She signaled the team leader with a series of precise gestures, outlining a maneuver that required a coordinated shift toward the upper western ridge, where the fragmented rock formations offered natural cover for an angled assault. The SEALs moved immediately, mirroring her instructions without hesitation as they relocated with practiced stealth under the pressure of sporadic enemy fire. She advanced with them, her boots gripping the rough terrain as she climbed toward a vantage point that would allow her to disrupt the enemy commander's final attempt at resistance. Once she reached the elevated perch, she dropped into a low stance and scanned the valley floor, identifying the commander's position among the tightly gathered group near the fractured ridge. The enemy's movements confirmed her suspicion the commander was signaling the remaining units to tighten their defensive arc creating a narrow corridor that could trap advancing forces while shielding the retreating operators positioned behind the ridge. She relayed this information to the team leader with calm precision, emphasizing the need to neutralize the command element before the formation locked into place. As the SEALs settled into firing positions, she calculated the timing required to strike before the enemy completed their reorganization. The hostile units were moving quickly, their silhouettes shifting across the terrain with controlled urgency that reflected their commander's disciplined guidance. She adjusted her optics again, tracking the subtle changes in their alignment, noting how their forward elements shifted to absorb pressure while the rear units consolidated into a firmer defensive line. The tightening formation signaled an impending push, one designed to break the SEALs' angle advantage by overwhelming them with simultaneous fire from multiple converging points. She breathed steadily and raised her hand in a brief signal, prompting the flanking operators to target the enemy's outer edge before the semicircle could fully form. The SEALs executed the instruction with quiet precision, disrupting the hostile alignment and forcing their forward elements to retreat into disarray. The strike group faltered under the sudden pressure, their coordinated push weakening as gaps formed between units that should have remained tightly connected. She recognized the disruption instantly, knowing that the enemy commander would attempt to correct the alignment within seconds if given the opportunity. The team leader signaled readiness for a coordinated assault, and she nodded sharply before shifting her aim toward the ridge where the hostile commander continued relaying orders with urgent precision. The enemy leader's silhouette flickered against the dim horizon, a faint outline directing the struggling units in a desperate attempt to salvage their deteriorating formation. She steadied her breath, tracking the commander's subtle movements, waiting for the exact moment when the hostile units shifted their weight collectively, a sign that the fallback defense was about to solidify. The moment arrived with chilling precision, as the enemy's forward elements aligned in near-perfect unison to create the reinforced arc meant to contain the SEALs' advance. She signaled the team to strike immediately, prompting a perfectly synchronized barrage that shattered the formation before the enemy could lock into their defensive posture. The volcanic burst of controlled fire rippled across the valley, sending hostile silhouettes scrambling for cover as their carefully rehearsed maneuver collapsed beneath the force of the coordinated assault. The enemy commander attempted to retreat behind the fractured ridge, but she repositioned swiftly and intercepted the movement with a precise shot that neutralized the leader before the remaining units could react. The strike broke the enemy's cohesion entirely, leaving the scattered operators without direction as their fallback formation disintegrated under the mounting pressure from the SEALs. She monitored the battlefield closely, confirming the steady decline in hostile signatures before signaling the team to advance and secure the remaining sectors. As the SEALs descended into the valley floor, they moved with controlled confidence, clearing the terrain methodically while maintaining overlapping fields of fire to guard against any last attempts at resistance. She followed the team leader down the slope, her eyes scanning the diminishing thermal patterns as she confirmed the collapse of the enemy's final line. The valley's tension gradually eased as the echoes of combat faded into the surrounding darkness, replaced by the steady rhythm of the team securing the area one section at a time. She lowered her optics slowly, taking in the quiet that settled over the ravine as the last hostile signatures diminished into silence. The final phase of the confrontation had ended with decisive clarity, shaped not by overwhelming power, but by the precision of her strategy and the team's flawless execution. The SEALs regrouped around her, their expressions calm yet resolute as they acknowledged the significance of what had just unfolded. And in that moment, one truth settled over the battlefield. They had broken the enemy's strongest formation, because she saw the pattern before anyone else ever could. The valley had quieted into a heavy stillness as the SEALs swept across the fractured terrain, their boots moving through scattered shell fragments and broken stone, while they methodically secured each section of the battlefield. She advanced steadily beside the team leader, her eyes adjusting from the intensity of the gunfire to the subdued glow of the moonlight stretching across the ridgeline. Although the enemy's resistance had collapsed minutes earlier, the silence held an uneasy weight that hinted at unfinished business beneath the surface of the confrontation. She knelt beside a narrow crevice where several hostile units had attempted to regroup before their final collapse, brushing aside displaced gravel to reveal faint tracks carved into the dirt by hurried movement. The patterns were uneven and erratic, suggesting panic rather than discipline. Yet something within the deeper grooves felt deliberate, as if certain individuals had been moving with intention while the rest struggled to escape. The SEAL team leader crouched beside her, his eyes narrowing as he studied the marks and recognized the same irregularity that had caught her attention. She adjusted her thermal display and scanned the surrounding terrain, observing the fading heat signatures of neutralized operators while searching for any anomaly that did not align with the mission's expected outcome. The device flickered as it detected a single residual hotspot deeper within the valley, one that did not match the scatter pattern of retreating forces or the positions of the earlier firefights. She rose slowly and signaled the team to tighten their formation, guiding them toward the faint thermal source with cautious steps shaped by instinct rather than certainty. As they approached the thermal anomaly, the terrain shifted into a shallow basin, partially concealed by overlapping rock formations, that created natural cover for anyone attempting to hide. She moved ahead of the team, her weapon angled upward, as she advanced into a narrow corridor framed by jagged stone that had been shielded from the earlier engagement. The basin carried a faint metallic scent mixed with dust and engine residue, suggesting equipment had been moved through the area before the final confrontation erupted. She slowed her pace as she noticed a trail of disturbed soil leading toward a flat slab of stone positioned unnaturally against the wall of the basin. The SEALs formed a protective semicircle around her as she approached the slab cautiously, her gloved fingers brushing against its edge to test its weight and confirm whether it had been repositioned recently. The subtle movement of fine dust sliding from the surface confirmed her suspicion the slab had been shifted within the past hour, likely by enemy units attempting to conceal something from view. She motioned for two operators to assist, and together they pushed the stone aside, revealing a narrow recess carved into the ground beneath the cover of the basin. Inside the recess lay a compact metallic case marked with faded insignia that did not match any known patterns associated with the region's hostile groups. Her expression hardened as she lifted the case, recognizing the type instantly a secure container used exclusively for high-value intelligence transfers during covert operations. The team leader exhaled quietly, understanding that the enemy had been carrying something far more significant than weapons or communication devices. She inspected the exterior of the case carefully, noting the scorched edges and faint signs of impact that suggested it had been transported through hostile conditions before reaching the valley. The locking mechanism was damaged, likely by hurried handling or deliberate sabotage, but the internal seal remained intact, indicating the contents had not been compromised. She held the case close and shifted her attention toward the surrounding basin, analyzing the disturbed terrain and fragmented footprints that hinted at a small group moving separately from the main strike unit. The SEALs waited silently as she evaluated the implications of the discovery, recognizing that the presence of such a container meant the confrontation in the valley had been more than a simple tactical engagement. She scanned the surrounding ridges again, her senses sharpened by the realization that the enemy's objective may not have been the assault operation itself, but the protection or transport of whatever was hidden within the case. The team leader asked quietly what she believed they had intercepted, but she shook her head, unwilling to speculate without analyzing the contents. She knelt again, placing the case carefully on a flat surface and examining the compromised locking mechanism for any signs of traps or secondary triggers designed to protect sensitive material. Her gloved fingertips traced the edges with steady precision, confirming the absence of additional hazards before preparing to breach the internal seal. The SEALs tightened their perimeter around her, their steely focus reflecting the understanding that the next few moments could redefine their understanding of the mission entirely. She applied gentle pressure to the damaged latch, easing it open with controlled precision until the internal seal finally disengaged. The case emitted a faint hiss as trapped air escaped, revealing a series of neatly arranged data cores embedded within reinforced housing that prevented damage during transport. She lifted one carefully, examining the encrypted identifier etched along its surface and recognizing the type instantly military-grade storage designed for classified reconnaissance intelligence. The valley's silence deepened as she turned the core over in her hands, realizing that the hostile strike group had not been operating independently but under instructions from a higher authority with access to sensitive information networks. The SEAL team leader studied her expression and understood the gravity of the situation without needing further explanation, knowing that the confrontation had taken on a dimension far beyond the immediate tactical victory. She slid the core back into the case and secured the damaged latch, acknowledging silently that the mission had evolved from a battle to a discovery. She stood slowly, scanning the ridgeline with renewed focus, while the SEALs formed around her in a protective arc that reflected the uncertainty now hanging over the valley. The night air pressed heavily against the broken terrain, amplifying the tension of the unanswered question. What intelligence had been important enough for the enemy to deploy an elite strike group under such hostile conditions? She tightened her grip on the case and signaled the team to regroup, preparing to extract the newfound evidence for further analysis. Because the battle had ended, but the truth behind it was only beginning to surface. The SEALs moved across the valley with disciplined precision as they prepared for extraction, their shadows stretching across the dim terrain while the quiet hum of distant engines signaled the approaching transport vehicles. She remained slightly ahead of the formation, her grip steady around the damaged intelligence case that now weighed more heavily on her than the firefight that had nearly consumed them earlier. Although the battlefield had fallen silent, a deeper tension lingered beneath the cooling night air, shaped not by the enemy's defeat, but by the mystery surrounding what they had uncovered. She reached the edge of the ravine and paused briefly, scanning the ridgeline for any final signs of hostile movement before signaling the team to advance toward the extraction point. The terrain felt different now, less oppressive, yet filled with the unmistakable sense that the confrontation had only revealed the first layer of something far more complex. The SEAL team leader approached her with controlled steps, his expression tight with unspoken concern, as he glanced at the sealed case secured against her vest. They descended along the narrow slope until the transport vehicles emerged from the darkness, their headlights dimmed to preserve concealment while the engines idled with a restrained rumble. She boarded the lead vehicle and took a seat near the rear, resting the intelligence case beside her while the rest of the team settled into their positions with a quiet efficiency that reflected the weight of the mission's aftermath. The door slid shut, and the vehicle lurched forward as the convoy moved away from the battleground that had nearly claimed them. Inside the dim cabin, the only sound was the steady vibration of the engine mixing with the rhythmic breathing of operators processing everything that had unfolded. She kept her eyes on the case resting beside her, its worn exterior illuminated faintly by the soft glow of the overhead light that flickered with each shift in terrain. The SEALs exchanged brief glances, sensing the significance of the object without needing to ask, recognizing that whatever it contained had driven the enemy to fight with an intensity far beyond typical regional engagements. The team leader leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as he asked whether she believed the data cores held operational intelligence or something more dangerous. She met his eyes with calm resolve, explaining that the patterns she observed during the battle suggested a level of coordination unlikely to originate from isolated groups operating independently. Her tone carried an unspoken warning that the case might contain proof of an intelligence network operating beneath the surface of conflicts they had barely begun to understand. As the convoy continued across the rugged terrain, she shifted her attention to the window, watching the valley fade into the distance beneath the pale glow of the retreating moon. The quiet landscape offered no clues about the forces that had orchestrated the strike, yet her instincts whispered that the enemy's aggression had been driven not by desperation, but by desperation to protect something critical. She inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper as they neared the forward operating base where the evidence would be secured. The vehicle slowed as the convoy approached the fortified perimeter, and she tightened her grip on the case one final time before rising to step into the cool night air. Floodlights swept across the staging zone while Marines moved briskly between positions, briefly glancing at the returning team with looks of relief and curiosity. She walked alongside the SEALs toward the command building, her posture steady despite the exhaustion that lingered beneath her controlled exterior. When she reached the secure entrance, the team paused behind her, watching silently as she prepared to hand over the intelligence case to the analysts waiting inside. Yet before crossing the threshold, she hesitated for a brief moment, sensing the shift in atmosphere that accompanied missions that unraveled larger truths than anyone anticipated. Her gaze settled on the sealed core within the case, recognizing that whatever awaited them on the other side of the door would reshape the mission far beyond the battlefield they had survived. And as she stepped forward, carrying the evidence that had cost the enemy everything to protect, one truth settled across her mind with unmistakable clarity. This fight was over, but the real war was only beginning.